Good morning, everyone. I thought might take a slight break from conservation of bass and talk a little bit about nuts and bolts of some management stuff that we do for them. And one question that I think a lot of folks have is how do length limits work? Or more importantly, under what conditions do they work and when do they not work? And what I'm going to talk about today has equal applicability, whether or not you're talking about bass or you're talking about perch or walleye or sauger or crappie, sunfish, just about anything you can imagine in freshwater that people like to fish for. The same kinds of factors really do dictate how well length limits work. So if you think about what populations are, you start, of course, with reproduction, right? Most fish are self-reproducing, but some fisheries are stocked. You think of trout, think of striped bass in the southeastern United States. And these fish undergo natural mortality, of course, as little fish, and they grow and they recruit what we call recruit into the fishery. And the fishery can be defined by the density and biomass of whatever population or species you're looking at. Density, how many fish per acre, let's just say, or per mile of stream. Biomass, how many pounds per acre or pounds per mile. And also size and age structure. How many big fish are there versus how many little fish are there, and how many old fish are there versus how many young fish are there. So once they recruit into the fishery, and then they have mortality that occurs. As the fish grow, of course, you have natural mortality. Fish die of old age, they die of diseases, they die by being eaten by something else, either bigger fish or fish-eating birds or fish-eating mammals like otters. Natural mortality occurs every single year in every fish population. And then, of course, you have fishing mortality. And we like to think that this is minimal in a lot of cases, especially when we think about bass, because everything's catch and release. But fishing mortality can be harvest, of course, what we call exploitation. But it also can be hooking mortality, release and they die, or tournament mortality, holding mortality, excessive handling mortality, such like that. So that's fishing mortality. So those are the pathways you have in a typical population of fish. Growth is one of the big factors in what populations can or can't do. Fisheries biologists have long recognized that how important that is, and they often try to manipulate growth, by manipulating prey or food resources, stocking food. That's more common in a pond or small impoundment than obviously it would be in a reservoir. But sometimes they stock non-native things, stocks, subspecies, or species, such as something like blueback herring, in an attempt to increase growth and size of fish. Obviously, the non-native fish stockings is really a minimal thing anymore, but it was done a lot by fish biologists 30, 40, 50 years ago before we really appreciated what that could do and some of the negative effects. And more commonly today, using habitat manipulation, trying to plant native plants, try to control excessive hydrilla, or other non-native plants like hyacinths, or just simply trying to put more habitat in the lake for fish to be able to use as reservoirs and impoundments age and the stuff that was flooded slowly goes away. Fish growth in all fish is pretty much a asymptotic relationship that looks like this. Fish grow fast in the beginning parts of their lifespan, and then they start leveling out as they get older. And usually the bend in that line occurs sometime during sexual maturity, when they start diverting resources away from growth in length or weight and towards growth in gonads. And how fast fish grow really have an effect on what your population looks like. And if you think about mortality, the fact is that all fish die. Mortality is, like I mentioned there already, is got two components, fishing and natural. Annual mortality is usually computed using age structure data. Collect a bunch of fish, you age them, and you see you're looking at the ratio essentially of young fish to old fish. And you need to have specific data collection in some way to accurately separate natural and fishing. And that's really important when you think about length limits. What is natural mortality rates of fishes typically? Sauger in the Tennessee River, it was estimated to be somewhere between 30 and 40%. Largemouth bass in Lake Eufaula on the Chattahoochee River between Georgia and Alabama, 20 to 30%. Smallmouth bass in Pickwick Lake, also on the Tennessee River in northern Alabama, 20 to 35%. Smallmouth bass in the Hudson River, same species, but much farther north up near Canada, 10 to 15%. Striped bass in the Atlantic Ocean, again, really, really low. These fish live to be age 30, so they have a very low natural mortality rate. But say crappie in Lake Weiss, which is a short-lived fish, very high, 40 to 60%. This is just some idea that natural mortality rate can be really variable among populations, among species, different life histories. So knowing what the natural mortality rate is very important when you're trying to decide how well a length limit is going to work. So what does all this mean in terms of how many big fish there is in an aquatic system? Why are some areas, some lakes, some rivers, whatever it is, have a bunch of big fish and others don't? So this is going to be, there's a lot going to be going on here, and I'm going to go as slow as possible and keep you guys in the loop. So this is all some population dynamics modeling. It's a theoretical situation, but it's going to illustrate the effects of natural mortality and growth on fish size. So if we look at the length here on the top and the number of fish on the bottom here, and under average growth conditions and 25% natural mortality rate. Okay, so that growth there is kind of modeled on a typical growth of largemouth bass, across the United States. And 25% natural mortality is a pretty typical number for black bass down in the southeastern United States. So for reference, we're going to look at age 3 fish, we're going to look at age 8 fish. Okay, so age 3 fish under this average growth scenario are reaching about 10 inches by their 3rd year. And under a 25% natural mortality rate with 0 fishing harvest. I'm just throwing fishing harvest out. Okay, there's about 60 fish that reach 10 inches out of 100 age 1 recruits. In other words, for every 100 fish that enter the population at age 1, 60 of them reach age 3. So I use 100 when I model, because the numbers you get subsequently are basically a percentage. 60 out of 100 means 60% of the fish that enter the population reach age 3. So they're 10 inches long, and you've already lost 40% of the fish before they even get there. If you look at age 8 fish, they're reaching about 18, 19 inches in 8 years, and only about 15% of the age 1 fish ever make it to that size under this natural mortality rate. So you can see that under average growth and a pretty average natural mortality rate, there's not a lot of fish that are reaching these bigger sizes. So what if we have a faster growing population, or either by increasing the growth rates in that population or just looking at another population with faster growth rates? Okay, look at the difference here. So now age 3 fish are reaching about 14, 13, 14 inches by age 3. If you look at the approximate size at age that the fish were reaching under average growth at age 8, you now see they're reaching that length at somewhere about 5.5 years old. And if you take a look and just draw a line mentally down here to see under the same natural mortality rate, you're saying that now about 30 fish out of 100 are reaching that size instead of 15. What does that mean? It means you're doubling the number of 18, 19-inch fish in the population just because the growth's a little bit faster. So you can see there's a huge difference in how many fish are reaching the size that we as anglers are interested in getting, just from growth rates alone. And of course, now at age 8, instead of reaching 18, 19 inches, these fish are reaching 22, 23 inches. So they're reaching larger sizes just because of growth rate. Now, what about if natural mortality rate was actually higher? Well, this tells you quickly how much of an effect natural mortality rate has on your size structure in the population. So Age 3 fish, which let's just go back to average growth, okay? So these are 10-inch fish, okay? Under the first scenario of natural mortality rate, we were saying about 60 roughly fish were reaching that size, and now you're down closer to 40. So you've lost 20% of fish reaching age 3 just from a 10% increase in natural mortality. It's even more apparent down here at age 8, where we had about 15% of the fish reaching age 8, and under this higher natural mortality rate, it's about half. So natural mortality rate really has an effect on how many big fish you have. And together, natural mortality rate and growth play a huge factor in determining whether or not length limits work. So if growth is slow, it takes a long time to reach the length limit, right? It takes a longer time. Well, with natural mortality rate, what does that mean? What it means is that each year longer it takes to reach the length limit, you're losing a significant proportion of fish before they ever get there. If natural mortality rate is higher, then the fact is that generally too many fish are going to die before ever reaching the length limit, and the length limit is just not going to produce any noticeable benefits. And the worst scenario of all is a high natural mortality rate and slow growth. That is what we call the kiss of death for length limits. Now, of course, all this assumes that harvest is high enough, right, to have a length limit for the first point. If they're not harvesting fish, then what is the length limit doing? Nothing. The key really is how much do natural and fishing mortality individually contribute to total annual mortality. The higher that fishing mortality contributes to total annual mortality, the better chance you have of length limits working. And a general rule is that the closer that those two are equal, the better chance the length limits will work. And obviously, if fishing mortality exceeds natural mortality, then you have a really good chance that they're going to work. So I set all this up to just as a background for some more directed things that we're going to talk about down the road about specific instances of where a length limit was imposed and why it was imposed and why that length limit was imposed as opposed to an alternate one. And fisheries biologists use these kinds of data and these kinds of decision processes to come up with the length limit that fits the needs and has the best chance of working, because there's nothing worse than putting a length limit on and having nothing happen. And I also wanted to present all of this just to give you as anglers an idea of, that length limits are not always something that will work. They do have limitations, and the population will actually dictate whether or not it works. So I hope you found this informative, and I look forward to talking about these kinds of factors down the road. Have a nice day.